you speak a little bit to where cannabis fits in to this overall scheme, and then maybe we can get into a conversation about how cannabis affects the body, the endocannabinoid system, and all of that.
That sounds great. I think, cannabis is, of course, shrouded in all this, prohibition and a lot of political, struggle and
A lot of different energies
a
surrounding
lot,
it.
it's gotten into a darker place, even like just sort of the information we have about it. I like to start always when I'm looking at what is the benefit of a plant or what are the weaknesses of it or the potential, dangers of it. I want to see what is the record of that plant look like across traditional cultures. And that's my number one form of evidence. Again, it's not like, people talk about, oh, it's woo-woo, it's folk medicine. Whether you call it that or not, those people were carrying oral traditions and written traditions about medicines to help their people that they cared a lot about. They didn't have time to sit around and go to the movies. No, they were living, and life was a struggle for a lot of people, and medicine was really important. So there's a lot of heart in it. There's a lot of intention in it, and there's a lot of empiricism. So I always go there first. And what I've done with cannabis, in my kind of digging into what is cannabis as a medicine, I've had to cut through that same kind of shrouding and sort of darkness of like, what really is it? When looking back at what are the records from Chinese medicine and the use of cannabis, and I've looked deeply into it and tried to find what are the threads. Because most of the time in school, in medical school, with Chinese medicine and the doctors from China and stuff, it's just kind of, we don't talk about it. You know, of course, the hemp seed, everybody knows that's
nutritional,
and it's generally there's a couple of great formulas that use ma zi ren, and ma is the word in Chinese for hemp or cannabis, right? For marijuana. And so ma zi is a seed. And so you got ma zi is the seed of the cannabis plant, right? And so that seed has been used really successfully for moistening up the bowels and helping with constipation. And you combine it with other herbs that have other, peristaltic actions, or, pull some fluids into the large intestine, and then like, mirabilitum, things like that. And then those will all work to kind of create this bowel. But beyond that, you start digging into what was actually cannabis used for as a medicine. And was it cannabis in the sense of, THC rich, or was it cannabis in the sense of hemp? Was it ragweed? It's really hard to determine that from the records that we do have, but there is some consistency across the writings I've examined in using cannabis for conditions that involve, something in Chinese medicine called wind, which I've talked about with you before, which is like the idea that there's an instability in the body. So there's a homeostatic stabilizing kind of effect from cannabis, where, it's instability in the mood. There's things like tics and twitches and tremors and dyskinesias and things of that nature that cannabis was really good for, that it's been recorded that people would use it for that. And again, it's hard to understand, were they using CBD at that time?
Right.
Or was it a strain that was blended? And we don't really know. The records are hard to follow. But clearly it was used for problems of the mind, people having anxiety, schizophrenia, people that had, mental instabilities. It would really help to bring back some balance to them. And, one of the things that I saw that people used was they made a cannabis wine, and it was made, so they would take it was like more like a cannabis wine extraction, I guess, but they would take their rice or sorghum wine that they would make, right? They'd ferment those grain, the grain, and create, an ethanol rich solution. And of course we know that, ethanol is a great way to extract cannabinoids, right? And so they would take the seeds with the coating on the seed, what do you call that? It's not the calyx, but it's actually, there's a coating around the seed as it sits on the plant, and that coating is covered in little hairs, right, little trichomes. Right. So it's got a lot of cannabinoid on it. But so they would put the seeds with those little trichomes into their solution, and they'd extract it, and they'd give it as this cannabis wine, and they'd give it to patients for different conditions. So it's clearly been used that way, and it has it's very safe medicine. But I think that part of the problem is just that we have a hard time understanding with this plant the differences in its phenotypes, in the different types or cultivars of cannabis, which is one of the things that makes the plant really unique. You can get a very different physiological effect from one strain, right, than another. And that's, and there, to some degree, some plants have that, but very few, and to that degree. And I think it's one of the things that makes cannabis unique and fascinating to me, is just that, God, there's so much. And we talk about, what does cannabis do? I'm like, well,
man, yeah.
Which part of cannabis? Which cannabis are you talking about?
Yeah, how are you using it? Yeah, and one reason why cannabis has caught the eye of a lot of pharmaceutical companies is because it's a very effective biochemical factory. As far as its resin content and the types and diversity of compounds that it produces, and then when you start thinking about how that can be manipulated either through breeding or genetic modification or whatever, there is just some massive potential to use cannabis as a tool to create all sorts of different chemical compounds in a much more efficient way in much higher concentrations than most plants are able to do. So it'll be interesting to see long term what cannabis becomes, because now that hemp is legal in the United States, and now that THC rich cannabis is gaining acceptance in the United States, at least on a state level, we're going to see very interesting things, I think, as far as where people take the plant and how they use it. And, we're still contributing to this millennia long record of medicinal plant use. And so we're entering an interesting time now where we're kind of coming out of the dark ages with cannabis and now generating a lot of information, a lot of data that, people that come through 100 years from now will be able to probably glean a lot of interesting wisdom that we may not be able to perceive directly, since we're kind of in it right now, trying to tease some of the stuff out, different cannabinoid ratios using different parts of the plant. Even on the beyond the medicine side, how cannabis can be used as building materials and contributing to fuels and, all sorts of stuff that, and being used as a bioremediation tool. It'll be interesting to see what we learn.
Yeah. And I think, you were talking about the toolbox, and what is, how does it fit into the toolbox? And I think I find it difficult to place it because it's been shrouded and because it's in the darkness, because we don't really know which part of it does which, and we've been kind of thinking of it more in molecular terms, right? We're thinking about THC, we're thinking about CBD, we're thinking about terpenes, sometimes thinking about flavonoids.
Right.
But in general, we're kind of thinking about it in these molecular terms, whereas with most of the plants that I use, sure, I like to make sure that the plant is a potent example of that plant species, that it has the medicine I'm looking for in it. So I want it standardized to some percentage of an active.
Yeah.
Not because that molecule is the thing that's doing the work. We found in a lot of studies that the molecule actually alone doesn't do the work. It needs to be the molecule in the matrix of plant compounds that represent that medicine. And so I think it's sort of changing that perspective as a plant on how we identify that medicine, how do we use it. And I think a lot of people are, I've heard this sort of approach from a lot of folks who are deep in the cannabis as medicine field. It's that, what we really need to do is just take apart the plant, pull it into all its pieces, and then select which pieces we want to put them together and apply it to the thing that we want to treat. And that's sort of, that's kind of like Franken medicine. Like, it's not
reverse engineering,
and reverse engineering can be really helpful, but I think we have to be careful here, because it's hard to understand what you lose, from like a purely molecular analysis. Yeah. What do we actually lose about, and maybe I'll just say this, that the spirit of the plant, and that's, again, getting into some woo-woo territory, but you know me, I'm going to bridge spirit to the deepest reductionist science.
It's kind of your like role in life, is just bridging those worlds
together. Those worlds. I love it. And it's really important to me. And I think it's profound for our culture to recognize that those two things exist simultaneously.
Yeah.
But so that there's a spirit of the plant and there's a spirit of it. And I think with cannabis, it's got such a long, rich history. And you think about India, and you think about the Ganges, and you think about this sort of like the steeping of that plant in this spiritual path to enlightenment and what it represents. And it's sort of there's a whole part of it too with the sadhus and the sort of like removing yourself from society and culture and like going other, and there's a lot of stigma and there's all this, but it's just really wrapped up in so much of who we are, and we've evolved with it for so long. I think that the plant itself is a very sensitive creature. It's a very sensitive, I don't know what I call it, like a life form, and I think that it picks up energy, you know, and I'm talking again on these little bit more quantum or esoteric level about how the way that it's grown, the way that it's cared for, the way that it's harvested, the way that it's being ingested. I think those things are exceptionally important with cannabis because of its deep connection to our psyche, our spiritual path. You know what I'm saying? I mean,
Well, yeah, I mean, to put it in more practical terms, the way a plant's handled changes its chemistry dramatically. The way that a plant like cannabis is administered in the body changes how your experience with it, is going to be, whether you're eating it or inhaling it or how you're preparing it. It's all influencing these different things. And because a lot of the compounds that cannabis makes are, in the growth cycle, just thinking about terpenes are so influenced by environment, and cannabinoids to a lesser extent, but still somewhat. And so how you process that plant is going to affect that chemical profile, how you store that plant, how you then later process that plant into a product that you're going to consume, whether it be foods or teas or whatever you're going to do, has that influence. And then getting into an equally complex area, trying to understand the endocannabinoid system tone of a person and what influences that, their lifestyle, their diet, all of these things. The way that you live is going to influence how you respond to cannabis, because it's changing all these things. And so, on my side, like when I hear you, using that language, the sensitivity to the energies and everything, to me, that's just because of my hyper analytical chemistry, side of things, and thinking about my experience with all of that. To me, that makes sense, and I can understand that from my vocabulary and my perspective of how I see it. To me, that gels together. And
like you can see it in that sort of reductionist view.
Yeah,
right?
You can see
when
it.
You
There's
look down, when you break
it.
down to the parts, you can see the parts have changed, right?
Right.
Based on the choices that were made. And of course, we're back to the ecosystem, back to that permaculture idea. And so how do we take care of the plant? And I think, just like I'm in Jackson County, Oregon here, right? There's 9,000 acres of hemp in this county.
In this one county.
This year, you know? And when you see these farms, they almost every single one of them is using sheets and sheets of single-use thin black plastic.
Yeah, huge monoculture farms.
I'm like, again, back to the energetics of the plant, and the plant itself, it's a representation of how we are acting. We're trying to make this medicine to heal, but then really a lot of the drive is for the money, and that unfortunate relationship between money and medicine has gotten us into all kinds of trouble.
Well, and it comes down to what do you really value and how are you making those decisions? And to touch on something you said a minute ago that ties into this of we don't know all of the little things about the chemistry of the plant that are influencing therapeutic outcomes. And there's research in Israel that is demonstrating this in a very direct way. There's a researcher, I think his name's David Miri, if I'm pronouncing that right, that has a lab in Israel with several dozen researchers there that are exploring all of these minor constituents of cannabis. And, they're not just characterizing a dozen or a couple of dozen cannabinoids. They're looking at, 50 to 100 cannabinoids in products and seeing how little manipulations to those affect therapeutic outcomes. They're looking at, hundreds of terpenes at a time and trying to understand those differences. And, the wisdom that they're gleaning is that, this is a very complex picture here, a very complex puzzle that we're trying to piece together, and that there are a lot of components of cannabis that, right now in Oregon, if you go to a cannabis lab, you're not going to be able to get quantitative data on, the 100 plus cannabinoids that are in the plant, or the, the hundreds and hundreds of terpenes, the several dozens of characterized flavonoids, the stilbenoids, the sterols, all these different things that are interacting together. And there's research now that shows that flavonoids interact directly with the endocannabinoid system in a very direct way, which then has implications for all plants and how they're interacting with this system, which then ties into, and this is just one example, but how that ties into, what you're eating is going to affect your experience with cannabis, and because it's influencing your endocannabinoid system tone. The puzzle is super complex, and we have to be really, really careful about how we're making decisions about what to value.